All right, let's get to the last notes of this unit, topic 2.4a, the spread of Hellenistic culture. The goal of this lesson is for you to be able to walk away being able to describe how the Hellenistic world created by Alexander, that is Alexander the Great, impacted trade, technology, science, and philosophy. Let's get into it. So timeline-wise, here you can see that each dot on this timeline represents about 25 years. This blue line here represents the length of the Hellenistic period, and this is the period that we're going to be talking about in today's lesson. Now, you'll notice a couple other things. For instance, if we look back in the timeline here, it comes right after what we call the Greek classical period that we were just studying. So you notice the period of Alexander the Great's conquest, pretty short here, the Peloponnesian Wars, the Greco-Persian Wars. This is actually a pretty short time scale, especially considering to everything else we've been talking about in this class, but even compared to the Hellenistic period, which is much longer, right? The Greco-Persian Wars, Peloponnesian War, Alexander's time, all that classical period, that's all just the precursor to this period we call the Hellenistic period, which is pretty important for the development of the world as we know it. You'll notice that the beginning of the Hellenistic period overlaps with the end of the Warring States period over in China, and extends all the way over here until right about the birth of the person that is known historically as Jesus of Nazareth, which is the birth of the Christian faith. So Hellenistic period lasts, about 3 centuries. Before we get into the Hellenistic period, we have to talk about the end of Alexander the Great's empire. Now, you might be thinking, what do you mean the end of it? Didn't it just start? We spent an entire class period debating whether or not this guy deserves the title great or not. So what happened to this massive empire he created? So, at its height, Alexander's empire encompassed about 2 million square miles. This is slightly smaller than the size of the Roman Empire at its peak. For reference, the continental United States, that's the 48 states that are connected to each other, not counting Alaska and Hawaii, is about 3 million square miles. So Alexander's empire is pretty sizable. It stretches in the west from Macedonia and Greece in the west, all the way to the east to the Indus River Valley, that's at its very edge over here, and then even encompasses Egypt, Mesopotamia, so it's a quite sizable empire. It only took 11 years for him to conquer all this territory, and in those 11 years, Alexander did not lose a single battle, right? That's pretty amazing. And in those 11 years, he founded over 70 new cities, many of which were named after himself. Now, in conquering all this area and unifying into a single empire, what he does is he takes this vast, diverse regions that are all under his control and puts it under a single rule of Macedonia. So effectively, inside one empire now, you've got Indus Valley culture, you've got Mesopotamian culture, you've got Egyptian culture, you've got the cultures of Anatolia, you've got Greece, Macedonian. All this is being mixed together into a single culture. However, as great as Alexander was or wasn't, depending on your view based on the documents that we analyzed in the previous class, his empire does collapse relatively quickly. Despite being victorious in every single battle for 11 years, after 13 years on the throne of Macedonia, he dies of a fever over here in the city of Babylon, where he kind of set up shop and was preparing to organize his empire. So he catches a fever, he gets sick. There's not a lot of details exactly what this was. Some theories say it might be an STD, others it could just be a common virus, we don't really know. But he dies of a fever, but he has no heir, no appointed successor to take the throne after he dies. He was really more interested in the conquering of things, not so much ruling of them or setting up a dynasty for himself. So on his deathbed, there's this story that says that his generals asked him, "Who do you leave your empire to?" And these may be apocryphal, meaning we don't know if he actually said them or not, but the story goes that when asked, "Who do you leave your empire to?" Alexander's last words were, "I leave it to the strongest." This, of course, leads to a civil war between many of Alexander's top generals, and it ends after a couple decades of fighting with the establishment of 4 new kingdoms, each led by a different one of Alexander's generals. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to make you memorize the names of these different kingdoms, the names of these rulers. The only one really important for the story that we're telling today is the kingdom of Ptolemy over here in Egypt, which is going to be coming into play in future units. Now, this is not to say that these other kingdoms aren't important or don't come into the historical story. It's just not part of the story that we're going to be telling in this class. However, despite the fact that this empire is now politically divided into multiple kingdoms, they still share a common culture, and this is what we refer to as the Hellenistic world. All right, now we can really get into the information that we need to help meet that goal of today. What is Hellenistic culture, and how is it connected to Alexander the Great? So Hellenistic just basically means Greek-like. It comes from a myth about the origin of the Greek people. We're not really going to get into that, but that's what Hellenistic means, Greek-like. Really, it's a culture that emerged after Alexander's conquest. After all these areas are put together in a single empire, you've got Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures all kind of starting to blend together. They're trading with each other, talking to each other, and so you see the bleeding of these four cultures together, and that's what we call Hellenistic culture. At the core of this Hellenistic culture was the idea that Greek became the common language for trade and education. Now, people still spoke their local dialects and languages across the empire. They didn't really disappear, but Greek kind of became the standard language of trade, much the same way that English is the language of international trade today. Like if you're going to do trade across the world, one of the most common languages that people speak is English, and that was Greek at this time, thanks to Alexander. Think about how much more easy trade becomes when you don't have to worry about a translator, right? If both people doing the trading speak the same language, it makes trade a lot easier, and this is going to have some pretty real benefits for the world. So you can see here this green is the area that was once part of Alexander's empire that fractures politically after his death with the civil war between his generals. You see throughout it a bunch of different cities that share the name Alexander. These are just a fraction of the cities that were founded by Alexander and his soldiers as they marched through these regions conquering. Now, the way it worked was that Alexander, he would march through and he would conquer areas and he would take locals onto his army and he would make them part of his army as he marched further and further in. But he'd also, as he went, leave portions of his army behind to create other outposts that he could then use to establish where he backtracked, need supplies, to watch his rear, to make sure that no one would come and attack him from behind. And a lot of these forts evolved into cities. Well, the people in these different cities, they wanted luxuries or things from their home further back west. So this is really what encouraged trade between these cities over here and the cities back here, because the people over here wanted those luxuries, those comforts from their culture back home, and that further helps accelerate this blending of cultures to create what we call Hellenistic culture. All right, so let's get into it. How did Hellenistic culture impact trade? First and foremost, as we talked about, with Greek being the common language of commerce and trade, it made it a lot easier to trade with people from different regions. And the cities founded by Alexander played a really important role in this, none more so than the city of Alexandria. Alexandria is probably the most important city of the Hellenistic period. It's a city created by Alexander's armies as they marched through Egypt, and it's founded right here at the mouth of the Nile in the Nile Delta, where the Nile Delta meets the Mediterranean Sea. It featured a massive harbor for ships to come in and out of, custom offices to tax anything that came through it, marketplaces for the selling of all the different goods coming in from across the empire, banks for promoting trade. And just as importantly was the great library of Alexandria that attracted scholars because it had the largest collection of scrolls in the world until it was accidentally burned down. Essentially what happened is every time a ship docked in the harbor of Alexandria, which was an important stopping point and trade point for ships across the Mediterranean, ships would dock there to offload their goods, but then soldiers from Alexandria, with this part of the agreement, would go onto the ship and look for any scrolls or books that were there on the ship. They would then take those, deposit them in the Library of Alexandria, where the scholars would make copies of them. They would return copies to the ship and keep the originals in the library. And this is how they created a massive, massive complex of all the collective knowledge of the ancient world in one place. This is basically like the internet of its day. For a scholar, this would be as revolutionary as students today see ChatGPT or AI, right? This massive warehouse of knowledge that you can draw from in order to learn, but then innovate from and build on. And because there was so much knowledge in this city, it also became the commercial capital of the Mediterranean Sea, as everyone wanted to come there to learn, and this just resulted in increased trade. Here you see the lighthouse, the Pharos Lighthouse, which was seen as one of the wonders of the ancient world. We don't actually know exactly what it looked like, but it was a giant lighthouse that was a beacon for ships, so anywhere in the region they could see it, and they would know this is where you come to dock for Alexandria. Now, these cities were multicultural. Now, what this meant was that you'd be walking through any number of the cities in the Hellenistic world, and you'd hear people speaking Greek. You'd hear them speaking Egyptian. You'd hear them speaking languages from as far east as the Indus Valley. You'd be able to buy resources, eat foods from all these different cultures. This is what made them multicultural, and it created because there was a vast trade network that connected Africa, Asia, and Europe that all kind of centered on Alexandria. Of course, its tendrils reach further down the Nile, all the way as far east as China, far west into North Africa, even into Hispania. And there is some connection here you can see right here to this early city that we're going to start talking about very soon, Rome. Now, what made this trade easier was the fact that everyone spoke the same language. They spoke Greek. Yes, they could speak multiple languages, but Greek was the common language shared by most merchants. They also all accepted the same currency, the same money, which, again, being able to speak the same language and use the same money makes it much easier to trade. On these trade routes, you'd see papyrus scrolls, so knowledge traveling all across this world, sharing ideas, spices, art, scrolls, wine, everything moved freely throughout this empire, which then allowed for this multicultural mixing. And as trade took off, new ports and roads were expanded overland and at sea in order to further encourage this trade. But again, what's being traded is not just resources or products, but ideas as well. And whenever ideas are being shared freely, you see massive improvement in technology. Speaking of which, how did Hellenistic culture impact science and technology of the ancient world? Let's take a look. Now, in the very early days of the Hellenistic period, this is soon after Alexander's death, there was an astronomer named Aristarchus who disproved the commonly believed idea that the sun was actually smaller than Greece. Now, today we know that's ridiculous, right? The sun is this massive object, but at the time, when you're only kind of looking up at it, it looks kind of small. They knew the basic idea that if you see something far away, it looks smaller. But they thought it couldn't possibly be that far away, so they thought the sun, in the most part in the ancient world, was roughly the size of ancient Greece or smaller. Now, Aristarchus actually disproved this idea. Now, he didn't get close to the actual size of the sun, but he made an important step furthering this idea. He also proposed the heliocentric model of the universe, but most people rejected this. Heliocentrism is the idea that everything in the solar system revolves around the sun. So he suggested this model, but most people didn't believe it. Instead, the dominant model was proposed by a guy named Ptolemy, who was an astronomer about 500 years later, and he proposed the idea of what we call a geocentric model, where everything goes, including the sun, goes around the Earth. This idea actually dominated scientific thoughts about astronomy for the next 1400 years and won't be disproven until we get to the Renaissance. We're going to get to that in second semester. Now, as impressive as that previous discovery of the sun being larger than Greece might sound to you, and I'm being a little facetious here, there was a guy who lived a few decades later in the mid-200s BCE named Eratosthenes, who was able to measure the circumference of the Earth. So, yeah, that like if you make a circle and draw a line through it, that's the circumference. He was able to calculate this using some simple math and shadows to an astonishing degree, right? He estimated the Earth was about 228,000 miles in circumference, but in truth, it's just shy of 25,000 miles. So he overshot it by about 3,000 miles. But considering the fact he was doing this essentially with columns and shadows and some simple math, this is really, really impressive work. Now, I'm not going to go over the math of all this, but these images kind of show that for you, and it'd be pretty interesting to ask a math teacher if they could do the same calculation today. Around the same time, a man named Euclid was kind of experimenting with geometry, and he creates the basis of all modern geometry that we use on a flat plane today. So this is a lot of the geometric math that you're doing in school today is based on what this guy discovered in the 300s BCE. Now, you might be familiar with the Pythagorean theorem, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared, and that's how you calculate the hypotenuse of a triangle. Now, a lot of people give credit to this to a philosopher named Pythagoras, but actually, the formula was known long before him by the ancient Babylonians and other cultures. They kind of figured that they had this idea as well, but the Pythagorean philosophy or cult, it's a really kind of weird thing we're talking about a little bit. It's not Pythagoras himself, but it's believed that his followers are the ones who kind of proved this theorem that gives us the modern Pythagorean formula. In the later half of the 300s BCE, so closer to about 200 BCE, lived a man named Archimedes, who was a very famous engineer who was able to apply a lot of these ideas to create some practical tools. Now, the first and foremost of this would be the Archimedean screw here, which is a way that can raise water from ground level up to a higher level. And you can see in this diagram, we still use the Archimedean screw today in the generation of electricity. So this is kind of that core step that we need for the generation of modern technology. He was also known for the creation of what's known as a compound pulley system. We use two different pulleys, a fixed and a movable one, and through this you can lift extremely heavy objects with very little force. This is something that you'll be working with when you get to your physics classes here at school. You can absolutely see the practical implications of this and how you can use less energy to move larger objects to build larger structures. In fact, many of the ideas were used by later Hellenistic scientists to build things like the force pump, pneumatic machines, and even there is evidence of a type of steam engine that was experimented with. So astronomy, mathematics, engineering, that's all practical. Let's move on to the Hellenistic culture's impact on philosophy. The first philosophical school I want to talk about is actually one of my favorites that I follow myself. It's called Stoicism. Now, Stoics value reason, nature, and emotional control above all else. They say that human desires, power, and wealth are all dangerous distractions that get us away from their true goal of life. They want to promote with their ideas social unity and encourage followers to focus on things that you can control and accept that there are things you just can't. And while a lot of high minded philosophy is about big concepts, Stoicism is about how to improve your daily life. Stoicism is practiced throughout the ages, and you can see that different philosophers added different things to it. One of the core tenets of it that it actually shares with the ideas of Buddhism is the idea of non attachment, the idea that you shouldn't get too attached to material things because that's going to be a dangerous distraction into the improvement of your life and it's going to make you miserable. Instead, you should focus on simplicity and strengthening your core values to improve who you are as a person. Furthermore, you should just radically accept the idea that there's a lot of things that you cannot control in your life, and so since those things you can't control, you should just not really worry about. Instead, focus on the things you can control to improve your life and your situation. And finally, the idea that you need to be honest and fair in dealing with all other people in order to create a better life for you and others. So you can see hopefully a lot that's appealing about the Stoic mindset. The next big philosophical school I want to talk about from the Hellenistic period is that of Epicureanism. Now, their philosophers taught that there are gods that run the universe, but those gods really don't care about and have no interest in the day-to-day actions of human beings. Instead, they said in reality, the only thing that's actually real are the things that you can experience with your five senses. That's taste, touch, sight, sound, and smell. For them, they said the greatest good and the highest pleasure came from virtuous conduct and the absence of pain. That's essentially avoiding things that hurt you, but making sure that you're always acting as a good person and making good moral choices. They said the main goal of humans was to achieve this harmony of both the mind and body through good actions. And they said, while you should avoid pain and try to do things that make you happy, it's important that you have moderation so that you don't, overdo it. Another very interesting facet of this philosophy is called the Epicurean paradox, where they're trying to explore this idea between, well, if there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God that rules everything, then how can evil exist, right? If they're all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, you go through this thought process, and you start to see some problems with that philosophy, right? If evil exists, yes, can God prevent evil? If the answer is no, then God's not all-powerful. Okay, so if the answer is yes, does God know about the evil? If the answer is no, then God's not all-knowing. If the answer is yes, does God want to prevent evil? If the answer is no, then God is not good and God is not loving. But if the answer is yes, he does want to prevent evil, then why is there evil in the first place? So you see the paradox at work here. There cannot be an all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful God if evil exists. That's why the thought experiments of philosophers will kind of drive you mad, but they're pretty interesting and help test your own ideas and beliefs about the world. And let's get back to Pythagoreanism. Yes, Pythagoras was a person, but Pythagoreanism is the school of thought founded by the man named Pythagoras. Now, this was not just a bunch of guys who were obsessed with the Pythagorean theorem. That's actually just something that came out of their school of thought. The Pythagorean philosophy was the idea that numbers are the foundation of reality, and all numbers have these inherent qualities, these aspects of them, and they have relationships with each other, that if you understand them, you can explain the structure and order of the universe. Essentially, numbers are the key to understanding all reality. And it's this school of thought that led to the exploration of mathematical patterns that you could find in nature, in music, and even the movement of celestial bodies. Essentially, you can find a mathematical formula that it can create or explain anything in nature, music, or the movement of the planets. Of course, their reliance on the idea that numbers are the foundation of reality kind of had some trouble for them when they discovered the existence of what we call irrational numbers, which you learn about in mathematics class. Because if numbers can be irrational, then can there be harmony in nature? And this is something that drove some Pythagoreans mad, at least according to some legends. Another interesting idea that they promoted was the idea that the soul was immortal, and they believed in the concept of reincarnation, just kind of like you would saw in Buddhism and Hinduism. Again, you see how this cross-pollination of cultures, as Hinduism comes from India, but Indian culture is kind of becoming mixed together as part of this Hellenistic culture, and you can see where it starts to influence the ideas of Pythagoreans. So they believed, yes, the soul was immortal and it would be reincarnated time and time again. However, the goal, just like in Buddhism and Hinduism, was to escape this eternal cycle of death and reincarnation. And for Pythagoreans, they said that living a virtuous life and achieving a higher state of existence can break you out of this through self-control and the pursuit of wisdom to purify your soul. This sounds a lot like what we were talking about when it came to the ideas of the Buddha. So again, you can see some overlap here, and how these cultures are really influencing each other, and how the Hellenistic culture really is a mix of all these different ideas. All right, that's it. That's the end. So at this point, just do what we usually do at the end here. Rewrite the goal, put those 3 important facts, and write one question that shows me that intellectual curiosity, and we'll see you for a review next class.